you seen this?
Welcome to Why Haven't You Seen This with me, Emily Barton. On this episode, I'm joined by my very good friend Trish Long. And Trish, you have chosen It's a Wonderful Life from 1946, directed by Frank Capra. And It's a Wonderful Life is certainly a film that everybody should see at least once in their life.
At least once. I would say at least once every year, Emily. Quite seriously. Ever since I discovered it, and I was well into my 20s before I did, which is why one of the reasons I've chosen this. I think there has not been a year which has gone by since when I haven't seen it at least once.
And do you watch it every Christmas religiously, or would you watch it any time of the year?
I'll tell you, there are two occasions I think it is most apt. One is if it's horribly dank, dreary, November-ish, December-ish, and you want to get in that kind of, you want to get the good vibes and good feels of Christmas rather than the kind of, very hallmarky type, then it's worth doing because it can trigger that and it reminds you of, what life can and should be. But the other times are, and I have actually genuinely used it twice with really good women friends for this, if you've got a friend who's actually lost their way in life and who like with one of my friends, she had been a nurse, she had done all sorts of wonderful things, she had traveled everywhere, and she came back and she just felt terribly flat and she didn't know what she wanted to do with her life and just was in a bit of a funk. And I remember thinking, I know what you need to see It's a Wonderful Life. And it actually happened to be screening in the IFI and I brought her and her mum to it. She came out and she was so jizzed after coming out of it that she went off and did something she had been at the back of her head to do, and she applied for a totally different type of course, went and started studying, late in her 20s, something totally different, and on the first day met the man who's now her husband, and they have 2 kids. And with another woman friend, similarly, I remember she was just very down and I felt at a loss as to how to cheer her up, and I remember inviting her to spend the weekend with me and making sure that I had a copy of this to watch with a bottle of wine, and it did the trick.
It's the go-to movie for cheering you up or giving you that extra pep in your step.
Yeah, it's not even the cheering you up because actually it's very dark.
It's quite dark, yeah.
Very dark. But it's more that it makes you think. For me, what it's about is, I'll tell you the story about it in a moment because there's, the story itself. But then for me, what it does is it reminds you of what would the world be like if you had never been born. It makes you think of all of the people that you've touched, all of the things in the world that are the better because of you, just because you're you and because you're in it. And that essentially is what it's about, the actual story is, I want to give you a bit of background first because what's been wonderful about this is, as you know, I wax lyrical about this movie all the time. And I always tell people, why I love it, et cetera, et cetera. But I obviously because of this, I kind of read back on some stuff with regard to it to kind of remind me of the background and things of it, which I'd known, but it was wonderful because I got to immerse myself and, think about it and look at it and read about it again. And I was reminded of the fact that even before it was made, it actually was one of those kind of stories that is about how somebody's coming from behind. It's about that struggle. It's about the good things happening if you persevere, if you stay with it kind of thing. Because it was actually written in 1939 by a guy with the most wonderful name of Philip Van Doren Stern, as you would. And he, for like 5 years, he tried to get it published. He hawked it around everywhere in LA and tried to get it published and couldn't. Finally gave up in 1943, and he printed, self-published in 1943, right? We think we've invented it. He self-published 200 copies of it, which he sent to all his friends as a, wait for it, 21-page Christmas card, right?
Oh my gosh.
And it ended up in the hands of an executive from RKO. And that's how it kind of eventually got made. Now at the time, they'd all sorts of people kind of attached to it, like when the executive kind of worked it up the ranks about, interesting somebody in it and whether or not they'd make it into a movie, and they finally decided to. And at one point, I think it was Cary Grant was attached to it, and all sorts of people like Doris Day and all of that were supposed to be in it. It's crazy to me now because when you look at it, and it's like Jimmy Stewart Donna Reid are just so, you can't imagine anybody else ever playing the characters of George Bailey and Mary Hatch Bailey now. But, you know, all sorts of people were attached to it. So anyway, I mean, so even before it got made, you know, it had this amazing story. And in the end, it was Capra who made it, you know. But what I find fascinating as well is the fact that even then, it's now so beloved, even though I'm always shocked about people who haven't seen it. You know, young people particularly haven't seen it because, of course, it's black and white, because it was made back in 1946. But now it's so beloved, and it's in so many kind of like people's top 10s, and like in American film history's top 50, and like George Bailey, I think, was number 7 in some poll somebody did of the most important film characters in American film history ever, and things like this. At the time that it was released, it was an utter failure. You know, it was released, I think it was Christmas 46, because they had to get it out there to qualify for the Academy Awards.
That's right.
But a wider release from Jan in 47. And for that year, of the 400 movies released that year, it was only at number 26, one behind Miracle on 34th Street, which I think is so interesting, because they're like chalk and cheese type Christmassy movies. And it had cost something like 3.7 million to make.
That's right.
And it only took in 3.3.
Yeah.
So it wasn't until something like the 70s and 80s that it was kind of rediscovered. And filmmakers of that era, who were kind of making very cool and interesting, you know, avant-garde type American indie movies, started citing Capra and started citing this as been one of their great influences. And it actually, I think, was rediscovered then. And I don't think there has been a Christmas that it hasn't been shown since. And as you're probably aware, being the great cinema fan you are, one of the great joys nowadays is to be able to actually get to see it in a cinema. One of the great joys of my life over the last 20, 30 years has been, there are so many cinemas now that just show it every year at Christmas, and you can actually see it as it was meant to be seen. And it's just the most wonderful, wonderful experience to do that. And imagine people seeing that for the first time and what it must have said to them.
And it's definitely one of those films that seeing it on the big screen is it's an experience in itself. I mean, you can see it on television over Christmas, but going to see it on the big screen, it just kind of amplifies the magic of the film itself. And I think, was it something to do with the copyright? There was some mistake around the copyright of the film in the 70s, and it wasn't renewed or something like that, and it basically allowed TV studios to show it for non-stop, and it became, just got this cult status going.
That's right. I think there was some story I remember reading once. I'm not quite sure of the facts, but you're absolutely right. There was something about it went out of copyright, and whoever had owned the copyright hadn't realized it in time and didn't apply to get it, you know, re-registered. And so there was something like a year or something when people could just continue to show and not have to pay any rights or whatever. And then I think it was all sorted, and now people pay to show it. But which is obviously only right and proper, because somebody made it and somebody people deserve to be paid and all of that. But I just love that. I love the fact that it was rediscovered, and I just love that it's in some ways it's a really simple story, but in other ways it's actually, every time I watch it, I see something different in it. Every time. And there are lines that I and my friends will often swap with each other, people who I then know are kind of real cinephiles, you know, people who really know their movies. If you quote a particular line, and there's different lines that work for different friends as well, you know, who's played by Donna Reid and plays his wife. The core character, shall we say, is George Bailey, and it starts when he's a kid, when he's a little boy, and he's obviously a very hardworking young man in this idyllic kind of one of these perfect American planned towns called Bedford Falls, you know. And it's beautiful. And he works in the local chemist, works in the local pharmacy after school. And it's also one of those little American ice cream parlors, you know. He works with this old pharmacist who you can see in it is a lovely man. And then one day he comes in and becomes really angry at him, and he sends him out to deliver medicine to various people. And George realizes that he's put the wrong medicine in. He's put like poison in something or another. And the guy won't hear of it. And we realize as adults that he's really drunk. He's actually very, very drunk. He looks like an alcoholic. And he boxes his ears and he sends him off. But cleverly, George doesn't deliver it. And when he comes back, and he actually saves this person's life by not delivering it. And it turns out when he comes back, he sees a letter telling that man that his son has just been killed, has just died. And obviously he's gone off the wagon and gotten drunk about it. And this is the first time you see it. And then later you see him off playing with his brother and friends, and they're, how do you pronounce it? Tobogganing? Tobogganing, thank you. I was like, that's not right. Tobogganing. And in a scene that becomes very, very important later on, he actually goes, a few of them go into the ice and he ends up saving his brother and one of them. And you have all of these stories of him as a kid, but the one that's really beautiful and really touches my heart is, you know, he gets between the box from the pharmacist on his ear and ending in the icy water when saving his brother, he ends up having an ear problem, which later stops him going into the army. He, in one of his ears, he's totally deaf. And so there's these little girls who are probably 10 or 11 or something, who come in to get their ice cream once a week or whatever. And one of them is real, you know, prissy and dressed up and, you know, perfect. And, you know, she's acting up to him. And then there's this other one who isn't, and who's quiet and humble. And who, when his bad ear is turned to her, says, "I really like you, George Bailey. I hope this is your bad ear," or something like this. And it's just so sweet, and it really stays with you. And she turns out to be the woman he later falls in love with, and he later marries. But it's very sweet, the setup. And then it jumps to years later. He's always reading, when he was a kid, he was always reading comics about travel and about buildings, and he dreams of being an architect and of going to college and of traveling to the most amazing cities where there's been all of this amazing architecture built. And that's one of the things that kind of, you know, drives him, and he works really, really hard for this. And you see him in a car, in a cab with the original Bert of Bert and Ernie, because one of them is a policeman and one of them is the taxi driver. And seemingly this was the inspiration for Bert and Ernie from the Muppets. Years later was a tribute to that, which I love as well. And he's about to take off to leave. Somebody comes running and stops the cab from leaving because his father's just had a stroke and he's not able to leave. And then next scene is 3 months later. He's in what's called the savings and loans, which we now call a credit union, which his dad and his uncle ran for the town. And you see him, and the cab's outside again to take him, and he's meeting with the board of trustees. They say that unless he works in the savings and loans, they won't underwrite it, because the bank and the town and the town council and all of that. So he ends up having to stay, and you know, it's really, and he says he'll stay for 3 years, and he saves money to stay for 3 years, and he does a deal with his brother. He's in the Air Force and saves all sorts of lives and becomes a hero in all of this. He does a deal that he will come back after 3 years, and he will kind of run it or whatever. And then when the end of the 3 years is up, he goes to meet him from the train. His brother gets off the train looking beautifully dapper and handsome as men of that era did. There's all black and white movies with their Crombie coats and everything. And then behind him comes this lovely young woman that he has just married. And he has obviously forgotten about his promise to his brother. But he says, you know, he will come back and live in the town, but he's gotten this great offer of this great job from his wife's family and whatever. So yet again, the lovely man that is George Bailey, his dreams have to be put on hold, and he's got to stay for another while. And during that time, there's wonderful, wonderful scenes. An amazing, iconic scene about a dance in a high school where they have this kind of ballroom floor that opens or closes over the swimming pool. I mean, think about this. This is 1946, a swimming pool in a high school for a start, right? You know, I mean, think about it. And this is not supposed to be a particularly rich town. You know, I mean, these people are kind of, you know, middle class and hardworking, but not rich. And there's these fabulous scenes where he's kind of acting a bit weird and a bit crazy because all of this has happened, and like he's kind of sick of being the good guy, and like he's just kind of dancing and doing mad things, and he ends up falling into the swimming pool with Mary, and loads of people then start jumping in, and it's, you know, there's this kind of big band has been playing, and there's just all these wonderful iconic scenes that are just these magical scenes that the more often you see the film, first of all, they make your heart warm because they remind you of all of that, but every single time I see it, I see something else, you know.
There's so many intricacies to it, and there's like even that thing about the experience with his ear, and then later the woman who he ultimately goes on to meet, she's hoping that she's whispering in that ear, like those really small touches that, like, everything has a meaning, and like there's so many layers to it. So to your point, like every time you watch it, there's something else there, something else hidden in it. It's so gorgeous.
There is, and the thing about it is, I mean, you know, that's kind of the backbone of the story, but then actually that's only the setup of the story, because the true story is about the fact that at this point he falls in love with Mary, they get married, they end up again, as they're supposed to leave on their honeymoon with the taxi outside, the uncle, who has become very, very absent-minded, and who still works there full time, mislaid actually in a newspaper in the bank where he went in to put it in and deposit it. He kind of absent-mindedly just left it somewhere, and he was distracted by the fact that on the newspaper that he was folding it into was news that the brother, who has become kind of very famous and has become a war hero in the past, has been given this big kind of congressional medal, and, you know, all of this. And he sees the Mr. Potter, the owner of the bank, who's also kind of owns half of the town and has built these horrible housing estates that he gouges people, you know, for, and who is not a very nice landlord. He sees him and he can't resist going over and saying, "Now, what do you think of the Bailey boys? Look, here's George about to get, or not George, his brother, about to get the congressional medal and come home and all that." And in his love of relaying that information, he mislays the money. Potter finds it, knows that it is the deposit from the credit union or from the savings and loan into the bank, and just doesn't say anything, just keeps it. And of course, if he can't make that deposit, then they're in trouble. And Potter makes sure people knows that the deposit hasn't been made, and they call in the examiner, and it just can't be found. So, and it's just as George and Mary are due to go on their honeymoon again, his dream of going to Europe, of seeing these wonderful places, and there's a run on the savings and loan where people all want to take their money out because they think that it's run out of money, and he's trying to explain that that's not how it works. It's not a bank, you know, that your money, half of it has gone in to help pay so-and-so's the deposit on his house, and, you know, his has helped, you know, him buy this business and whatever. And in the end, he starts trying to calm it all down, and the examiner's inside waiting to kind of find out what's going on. And if they end up getting to, I think it's 6 o'clock, without having a run on the bank, without having to close the bank down, they can kind of officially stay open. And the only way they can do it is Mary comes in with their money, their cash that they had saved for their honeymoon, and they use that to give people, instead of, you know, so that they won't do a run on the savings and loans in the end. So she has done a deal, this gorgeous old house that they used to walk past coming back from, you know, the high school dance or the whatever, and it's falling down, huge kind of rambling thing with no windows and all sorts of things. She recreates it as almost like a Hawaiian place with all these travel posters, and she roasts a chicken over a fire that she runs by the turntable of a record, and like Bert and Ernie are outside turning it outside the window and things like this. And so when he gets back that night after the run on savings and loan, and when he can't leave, that's what he comes home to. And then it jumps to years later, they've got 4 kids, he's fine, you know, they're perfectly happy. But then I think another problem happens, and similar to, and it again is down to the uncle. This time they can't find the money. They end up closing down the savings and loan. The examiner's there trying to close it down. He just doesn't know how to deal with it. He goes home. He's really horrible to everybody. He shouts one of the kids' teachers, and he is just really not himself, and you can see that things are really, really off. And a thing comes off the staircase, and he talks about how much he hates the house and how horrible their lives are. Why did we have all these children? And his little girl is in bed sick with the flu because she's trying to preserve a little flower to bring home to them, and he ends up like the petals fall off, and she's saying, "Daddy, fix it," and he tries to stick the petals back on, and he can't. He hides them in his pocket instead, but he goes out and he ends up going to the bar of a man who he helped at one point with the savings and loan to buy his business. He ends up getting drunk. Martini's is the name of the place. Martini can't understand it because they've never seen him like this. And in the end, he crashes his car into a tree, and he just stands on the bridge, and he decides that the insurance policy will be the thing that will save his family and the savings and loan, and he's going to kill himself. And he goes to jump in, and just before he jumps in, you see movement in the river, and you realize that there's a body in there already. You're not sure if he's saving the body or the body is saving him. And in the end, they're both drying out in this workman's shed. The working guy is asking him, you know, what's his name and where is he from? And he's talking about being from up there and how was sent down to save George Bailey. And George Bailey's like, "What are you talking about? I jumped in to save you." And it becomes really obvious to you that that Clarence, who is explaining that he's an angel and he's been sent down to try and get his wings by saving George Bailey, who claims that he doesn't need to be saved. And then it becomes a little bit like there's little overtones of things like of maybe a Christmas Carol or something, like with, you know, or I only thought about that years later, you know. I don't know if you ever thought that, Emily, you know, but
yeah, I did. Yeah, I was just thinking that, you know, even sort of Mr. Potter is very like Scrooge, and that sort of whole thing about showing him, well, I suppose with Christmas Carol, it's looking at the past, the present, and the future. With George Bailey, it's sort of showing him what life would be like if he had never existed.
Never been born, if he had never existed, yeah. But because of the way they do it, always for me, the part of Christmas Carol that's so powerful is when he goes back and visits and sees what people's lives are. And obviously that's the nugget that they must have taken and utilized in this way. Because in this, Clarence brings him past Martini's, which is now a horrible dive of a place, and he can't understand why, and he gets thrown out of it. And it's because Martini's become this horrible man because of the life he's had to live, etc., etc., and because George hadn't been there to help run the savings and loans, which gave him this proper loan that didn't gouge him. He goes to visit his mother, who is now running a really run-down boarding house and is having to take in not very savory people. And he goes to try, and he runs back, and he's in the cemetery, and he sees the gravestone for his brother, and he's like, no, he didn't die. And he said, yes, he did, because you weren't there to save him. And all of those people that he could have saved, you know, in the war, weren't saved because you weren't there to, you know, to save him. And then the bit that always makes me really, and it's a private joke with a woman friend who used to be the director of the National Library, and we try and watch it every year together, and it always makes me laugh, where when he asks about Mary and he wants to go and visit Mary, Clarence says, "You're not gonna like it, George," in this awful tone of foreboding, of like it's the worst thing that could happen a woman. She's just about to close up the library, you know, in this kind of like, as it was like the worst fate that could befall any woman would be to become a librarian.
She appears very sort of old maid and bookish, and, you know, without him she's sort of, you know, the spinstery sort type of character.
Exactly, yeah, her hair kind of pinned back in a weird bun and these weird glasses and all very prim and proper and everything, and in fact this mad guy, this mad version of George Bailey, goes up to her, and of course she doesn't know who it is, because the real, you know, George Bailey has not existed, and she's kind of like, oh, she faints, and he, you know, and he's kind of almost arrested for kind of harassing her and things like this. So it's kind of wonderful in that sense. And then with some magic and with some a lovely sleight of hand, finally he tries to run back to the house, and Like there's something that happens that makes him suddenly begin to think, oh, it's snowing. And then Bert pulls up, the guard, and says, what are you doing? And he said, you know me, because everybody else hasn't known him. His mother didn't know him, Martini didn't know him, Mary didn't know him because he didn't exist. He suddenly realizes that life is worth living, and that what one brings to life and what one brings to people is what's most important, and that he will figure out a way to make it work. That's when Bert comes along and it's snowing and you realize, and then he sees that his car has crashed into the tree and he runs back to the house. And back at the house, Mary has been going crazy looking for him. All his friends and family have been out. And then this piece that I post on my Facebook page every New Year's Eve as my way of wishing my friends a Happy New Year happens. And it's the Old Lang Syne scene where tons of people, because of what he's done for them in their lives, all come together and all donate $1 or dimes or anything to actually have enough money to pay back and to not have the savings and loan be closed down. And his brother arrives in the middle of it, but beautiful bit of it, they're all singing Old Lang Syne. And in the midst of all the money, he sees this old book, and he picks up the book and he opens it, and it says, remember, no man is a failure who has friends.
That's
Thank
gorgeous.
Thank you for the
Absolutely
wing,
gorgeous.
Clarence. And it's just beautiful, and it makes me cry. I mean, even thinking about it, it makes me cry.
And it brings home to you that whole thing of that in helping and in allowing people to help you, you also give them wings, and you also allow them to grow and develop. And at that point, a little bell on the tree rings.
It has that really good balance between the way people might perceive it, of this soppy Christmas feel good, in inverted commas, ultimately feel good film, but it's a dark film about, alcoholism, child abuse, attempted suicide, public drunkenness. There's all these like dark themes, and ultimately you have this man who actually, is coming to terms with the fact that he has all these dreams, but it's really about him realizing that whatever you're thinking about the future and what your hopes are and your dreams are, being able to come back down into the present and realize that every day you're having an impact on the people around you and the environment around you, and that means so much to the people around you. And special movies like that, the ones where the directors are inventing, new ways of making things happen, they always end up being these incredible films. Because I think it took something like 3 months to build that set, and it was the longest set ever made in America. And the 3 city blocks, I mean, just absolutely phenomenal. And what was interesting, I didn't realize this, because I had done a radio show a couple of years ago. 2 years ago I did one, and I was talking about one of my favorite films, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. It was one of the three films that won the Big Five in the Oscars: the Best Actor, Best Actress, Best Film, Best Director, and Best Screenplay. And the other ones was Silence of the Lambs and It Happened One Night, which was also directed by Frank Capra. And you kind of think it's a shame that it didn't do the business. It wasn't appreciated when it came out, because I feel like it's a candidate for a Big Five. It's such an incredible film.
It was nominated for all of those 5, and it didn't win a single Oscar. And it wasn't commercially successful. But I also think what's lovely about that, and that's why it's so important that people see these movies, and and people like Scorsese and others have been working so hard to kind of get people to think about it and to invest in preserving this kind of history, is what it says to us now, as well as how it moves one personally, or how one can use it with one's friends and family to have particular kinds of conversations, is what it also says to young people, or not so young people, people who are just trying to create and coming up against all sorts of obstacles, is you just keep going, you just keep persisting. And look, even if you go back to the original part of the story about Philip Van Doren Stern, who tried for 4 years to get this big puppet, finally gave up and just turned it into a Christmas card, and then it ends up being this iconic movie that, you know, many years later is just re-embraced and has such influence on so many.
It's an incredible film, and I hope, I mean, this conversation, it's making me really want to watch it again. For me, all of my favourite films are the films that every time you watch it, it's not just watching back in anticipation of the scenes that you like, but it's watching a film and every time taking something different from it, and it's making me want to watch it again to revisit, you know, what are the things that I didn't pick up the other times I watched it. So I'm hoping that, you know, thank you so much for bringing this one into the podcast, because I think it's such a great film, and it really genuinely is a film that everybody should see at least once. And hopefully anyone listening to this podcast will, if they haven't seen it in a while, like me, will be inspired to check it out again. And if anyone hasn't seen it, because maybe they put it into that box of, oh, it's an old Christmas movie that some people are nostalgic about, it's inspired them. It's a black and white movie, exactly, yeah. So hopefully it's inspired people to check it out. So thanks so much, Trish.
Why, oh why haven't you seen this? Why, oh why haven't you seen